Hi there guys, I hope you have had a good day. Now, interestingly enough, apparently Anthony Joshua was going to be using Andy Ruiz Jr. as a sparring partner for his preparations for Jarrell Miller. But then, obviously, Andy Ruiz Jr. was the guy that Anthony Joshua was actually fighting instead of Jarrell Miller, because obviously Jarrell Miller got popped and then he was pulled away from this fight, and Andy Ruiz saw an opportunity. Now, at first, David Ganza was the guy who contacted Andy Ruiz Jr. with regards to being a sparring partner for the Jarrell Miller fight, but he never responded to Ganza. But then Eddie Hearn reached out and Andy Ruiz contacted him immediately, saying that he would be interested in sparring and asked him how long they would need him for. But then after the Miller situation, Ruiz contacted Eddie Hearn and said that he would now like to be considered as a contender for Anthony Joshua and a potential opponent instead of a sparring partner. And that was when he became a possibility. There were many possibilities on the table. There was Trevor Bryan, Andy Ruiz was obviously one of them, and Michael Hunter. But ultimately, Eddie Hearn believed that Andy Ruiz would be the best fight for Anthony Joshua, the one that would be most entertaining. Maybe Ruiz doesn't look aesthetically pleasing like maybe Trevor Bryan would, but ultimately that meant he would have the best fighter in there with Anthony Joshua, the best one that he could find, which he wanted to do considering it was Anthony Joshua's pro debut in America and at Madison Square Garden. So Eddie Hearn wanted to put on a good fight. So did Anthony Joshua, considering this was his pro debut in America. So he could not really sell Anthony Joshua versus Trevor Bryan, someone who Eddie Hearn and probably Anthony Joshua believed wouldn't last 2 or 3 rounds. But then, was Ruiz ever supposed to last that long? I mean, obviously that's why they picked him, because he was the best opponent they could pick. But ultimately, they ended up in there with a better fighter than the guy they were going to be fighting anyway, Jarrell Miller. I mean, Andy Ruiz is probably levels above Jarrell Miller, because we know why Miller was so fast and had that kind of endurance. We know the reasons for that now. But it is interesting to see that Andy Ruiz was being considered as an opponent in the sparring sessions for Anthony Joshua as opposed to in the ring on fight night, because obviously Jarrell Miller had kind of a difficult style, but again, we do know the reasons for that. But ultimately, he had a different style, extremely heavy, mad endurance, and good speed as well, considering he was over 300 pounds. Then in comes Andy Ruiz Jr., who's probably got better endurance considering all of what we know, faster hands as well, more powerful, and a better boxer. So ultimately, Anthony Joshua was getting ready for Jarrell Miller, but then he ended up in there with a better fighter. But Andy Ruiz was going to be drafted in because he could replicate the style of Jarrell Miller. Imagine if Anthony Joshua had sparring like that. Andy Ruiz for Jarrell Miller, sparring someone who's better than the guy he's going to be in the ring with. I mean, there were going to be no slip-ups against Jarrell Miller, because if Jarrell Miller hadn't got caught, there was no way he'd have that kind of endurance, that speed, and whatever he brings to the table, that was down to something that was being put into his system, not necessarily down to the fighter. So Anthony Joshua, I believe, would have definitely beat Jarrell Miller. But ultimately, Anthony Joshua found himself in there with a fighter he hadn't been preparing for, but a fighter he had planned to bring in preparation for his actual fight, but ended up in the ring with him instead. And I think what this shows us is the incredible opportunity and the incredible chance that Andy Ruiz Jr. had. I mean, he was being considered for a sparring partner 5 or 6 weeks out from this fight with Jarrell Miller. Then, 5 or 6 weeks later, he's in there fighting Anthony Joshua. So what a great opportunity this was. And boy did he take it. And it does seem like such a long time ago now, because Anthony Joshua has already rematched Andy Ruiz and regained his heavyweight world titles and will now defend them against Kubrat Pulev in December. Now, Anthony Joshua has been out of the ring for a year because obviously he's fighting December 12th against Kubrat Pulev. He fought Andy Ruiz in the rematch December 7th, 2019. So he has been out of the ring for a full year now. But the thing is, in that fight in the rematch with Andy Ruiz, Anthony Joshua had a chance to make history of his own. Obviously, Andy Ruiz was the first Mexican heavyweight champion ever. Then Anthony Joshua had the opportunity to become the only 4th man in history to become a 2-time heavyweight world champion in an immediate rematch, joining Floyd Patterson, Muhammad Ali, and Lennox Lewis. Anthony Joshua is now the 4th name alongside them. And while that first fight with Ruiz can be considered maybe as a negative experience, it's one thing that Anthony Joshua was able to turn into a positive experience, because I believe that in the rematch, he's shown a lot more maturity and a lot more patience in the fight, because it's not just about going in there and trying to blow your opponent away. Just because you have power doesn't mean you can always knock the opponent out. Doesn't mean that they don't have the durability to stand up to that power. Because the thing is, in that fight, Anthony Joshua did hurt Andy Ruiz. In the first one, he dropped him, and maybe he did hurt him after that. But Ruiz gambled. Ruiz could not go backwards. The only thing he knew how to do was go forwards, and that's what he done. That gamble paid off. But in the rematch, Anthony Joshua knew that if he hurts Ruiz, then he needs to make sure that he's actually gone before he rushes in for the finish. So he's shown that kind of maturity in the rematch, something that maybe he did need, because I believe that in that first fight, most of it was down to inexperience, rushing in too quickly when he had his man hurt. Because let's not forget, that was Anthony Joshua's 23rd fight, and he had already been in a number of world title fights, so he was still extremely inexperienced and didn't have that patience. He wanted to rush in and close the show. The same thing nearly cost him against Vladimir Klitschko. He was on top, dropped Klitschko, but then rushed in too quickly for the finish, got fatigued, and then dropped himself in the next round. But the difference is, Ruiz has a different kind of style to Vladimir Klitschko, and it was a style that is made for that kind of fight, getting on the inside, trading up. One thing that Anthony Joshua did not try to stop against Ruiz, and when he did, when Rob McCracken was telling him, jab, jab, right hand, but ultimately Anthony Joshua was too far gone. He was too fatigued and too badly hurt to take that kind of advice and put it into motion. And it was an experience that Anthony Joshua learnt from the hard way. But ultimately look at the results of that, being able to come back just 6 months later, getting straight back in there with Andy Ruiz at a neutral location as well, and regaining his heavyweight world titles. That was a defining moment for Anthony Joshua, bigger than Klitschko, bigger than Charles Martin, because he regained his belts. And I think that in that fight, Anthony Joshua was more elated than he was at the end of the Klitschko fight or the Charles Martin fight, because that was the big fight for him. He was asking for undisputed straight after that, because that kind of scene that was set with it all on the line was something that Anthony Joshua did really enjoy, I believe, because he said after the fight that he wants these big fights now. He wants these defining moments like the Andy Ruiz rematch. So those were the fights that Anthony Joshua wanted to have. And ultimately, the Tyson Fury fight will be just like that, if not bigger. I believe it will be bigger because obviously that's for undisputed. The best heavyweight in the world. Two Brits showing down to see who is number one. That is why that is such a big fight. And obviously Anthony Joshua is ready for those kind of defining moments. And who knows, maybe the Andy Ruiz Jr. loss might teach him all he needs to know in order to get there. Because obviously Anthony Joshua had a lesson that he needed to learn. And the best way is to learn from those mistakes that he made in that Ruiz fight. Because Ruiz had success when Anthony Joshua allowed him to have success. And he didn't allow that to happen in the rematch. That is why Anthony Joshua won. He controlled Ruiz for the whole fight. Anytime Ruiz started to get brave and try and come in, that was when he was met with a straight right hand that hurt him. So Ruiz wasn't coming in the same way in the second fight as he did in the first one. And that was down to Anthony Joshua preventing that from happening, making sure that Ruiz stays on the outside. Jab, jab, right hand, like Rob McCracken was trying to explain to him in the first fight. But ultimately Anthony Joshua done that in the second one. He was fully prepared in the rematch for Andy Ruiz, whereas in the first one he was fully prepared for Jarrell Miller, had all the animosity built up from the build up to that fight, and he put that into the ring. But ultimately he didn't have anyone on the receiving end of his punches that he really wanted to have that spite for, because I mean Jarrell Miller in the build up was goading Anthony Joshua, taking him to a place he'd never been before with that kind of back and forth in the build up. So Joshua had that animosity, but nothing to do with it because he didn't have that same kind of animosity towards Andy Ruiz as he did for Jarrell Miller. So ultimately the stars aligned for Andy Ruiz on June 1st, 2019, and Anthony Joshua put it right December 7th, 2019, just a few months after that fight. But having said that, Ruiz has an incredible story, being considered as a sparring partner for Anthony Joshua, then ends up in there with the opportunity of a lifetime, and he took it. So Ruiz was able to make history. Guys, anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Andy Ruiz was being considered as a sparring partner for Anthony Joshua in preparation for Jarrell Miller, but found himself in the ring in a world title opportunity instead. Incredible. Guys, anyway, drop your thoughts on this in the comments below, leave a thumbs up, and subscribe if you are new. Thanks, guys.